In the second video for this session, I would like to talk about the Marxist critique specifically. Why the Marxist critique of the 6 ones that are explained in the book? Well, there are a number of reasons here, and I want to point specifically to 2 of them. The first one is that, in fact, the Marxist critique is a very rich critique. It includes a number of aspects that you will also find in other critiques, and I will mention where and which ones those are in a second when I get to the detail of it. The second point is, again, also a kind of illustration, which is that a kind of historical critique is often also still relevant today. Now, in the case of Marxism, but also in the case, for example, of utilitarianism, you still have theorists using these frameworks and adapting them to the present day context, thereby often also refining or improving the arguments that underlie these critiques. So this is therefore another reason to look specifically at the Marxist critique to see how the evolution, so to say, of such a criticism pans out. So the question that I wanted you to answer reading the chapter is, to what extent is the Marxist critique still relevant today? And also I wanted you to do that in reference to a present day example. In my view, if we look back at the original Marxist critique of human rights, there are 3 points. Now, before I get to them, it is worthwhile mentioning that Karl Marx's relationship to human rights is more ambiguous than this, and in the podcast that I assigned for today, if you listen to it, Samuel Moyn actually explains a little bit what this ambiguity entails. So if you look at Marx's criticism and the criticism of those that followed him and his theoretical framework, the first point would be that they are opposed, or at least highly critical, of the conception of liberal individualism. If we think back to the first weeks when we talked about the centrality of the individual, the centrality of the autonomous, dignified human being as being at the center of what rights are all about, then the Marxist critique there would be that it's actually a fallacy to believe that we should have this individual, this autonomized individual at the center. Rather, human beings are always embedded in social frameworks. They are always social beings. So what is actually needed in order to achieve emancipation is a sort of larger framework that takes into account the collectivity and the fact that freedom, equality can only be enjoyed in relation to other human beings. For Marx specifically, that meant the mobilization of the working class, but also in other human rights critiques, there is a strong element of criticizing this liberal individualism. For example, when we look at the post-colonial critiques, there is often also a very strong emphasis on the fact that the collectivity, the group, comes first. The second point that we can derive from the Marxist critique, even for today, is his criticism of the insufficiency, so to say, of political emancipation. Obviously, the human rights framework is focused on the state and more specifically the relationship between the state and the individual. Now, according to the Marxist critique, it is important to understand what civil and political rights are, and it is also important to curtail the power of the state. However, Marx would be adamant to say that this is clearly not sufficient for human emancipation. Rather, human beings are being oppressed by other forces that arguably are more important. And here in particular, of course, the economic system comes in very importantly. So it's the relationship of the individual to his or her employer, to labor in general, to their work, that also will determine whether a person is really free and lives in an equal sort of system. So this is the second point, the arguably implicit critique of state centrism. And obviously there are variations of this sort of argument, for example, in the feminist critique, which considers oppressive structures to be much larger than only the state. And the third point, somewhat related and most probably familiar to you, is Marx's emphasis of the primacy of the economy over politics. Now, obviously, politics are a place, an arena where struggles happen, where powerful forces fight against one another. However, in his view, really what is underlying that, so this is where he makes an argument of there being a political superstructure and a kind of economic substructure, a root cause, so to say. What drives political conflict is actually the economic relation between various actors. Obviously, in the 19th century, when Marx was living, it was the relationship between the workers on the other hand, the working class, and the bourgeois capitalist class on the other hand. And according to Marx, there's very little that the rights framework will do to remedy or to really change the relation in the economic sphere. Rather, according to him, there will be a distraction. There will be some political rights given, some negative rights will be accorded to those who are on the losing side, so to say, of the economic battle. But at the end of the day, the system of oppression will remain in place. And it is this kind of critique that, for example, Samuel Moyn, when talking about the powerlessness or the weakness of the human rights framework in addressing economic inequalities, that's the sort of very original historical argument that Samuel Moyn, of course, is also inspired by and draws upon. So what then about the example that I asked you for? There can of course be many, and probably you chose another one than I did, but I want to very briefly give one here that is in my view quite suitable to look at from a Marxist lens, and that's the question of race relations, specifically in the United States, though not only. Usually approached as a civil rights, so again, sort of human rights question. In fact, we gain a lot from looking at it from a Marxist perspective. Now, obviously, in the last 50, 60 years, there has been a lot of progress when it comes to race relations in the United States. As recently as 5 years ago, there was a black president in office in the United States, which would have been utterly unimaginable, let's say even 30 years ago. Nowadays, we find people having access. There's no segregation anymore, for example, as there used to be in buses. And all of this is very much to be considered progress. However, if an individual, such as, for example, Barack Obama and many others, of course, can make it in the society, can make it to the highest office of the land, that doesn't mean that the group, and here we get to the first point of criticism of Marxism, that the group as a whole, so African Americans most notably, are still not facing major challenges today. And obviously these days we had the Derek Chauvin trial in the news, and the question of police violence has loomed large ever since the killing of George Floyd last year. The fact of the matter is that black communities, in particular in the United States, are afraid of what an encounter with the police will entail. And that, of course, shows us that despite the civil rights progress, there still are major, formidable challenges. The second point of the Marxist critique is that we should focus or should keep a close eye on the economic relation. As we know, of course, there are many disenfranchised communities that have, particularly since the 80s, 90s, really suffered from also being economically disadvantaged. The fact that we have a disproportionate amount of African Americans in prisons has something to do, of course, with the way the criminal justice system works, but also something to do with the economic situation, the realities, the economic disparity that exists in many of the neighborhoods from which these, especially young men, actually originate. And when looked upon from this perspective, we actually can see that there has not been progress, but actually rather a regression. If we look at the wealth divide in race, the graph that you see here next to me, we can really wonder whether the situation is actually better than it was 30, 40 years ago, or whether it is worse. And the Marxist critique gives us a powerful tool to ask these relevant questions. I will leave it at this, and I look forward to discussing these questions and your particular takes on the human rights critiques during the live session.